Simcha, celebration, Simcha, Simcha, celebration of life.
Welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I am your host, Eitan Berger. Rabbi Abraham Cooper is the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a leading Jewish human rights organization with over 400,000 family members. In 1977, he moved to Los Angeles to help Rabbi Marvin Here found the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Rabbi Cooper had the remarkable opportunity to know and work closely with Simon Wiesenthal of blessed memory for nearly 30 years. We caught up with him at the recent Sinai in Darba, where he shared with us some of his stories about Simon Wiesenthal.
My name is Rabbi Abraham Cooper. I came to Los Angeles in 1977 to help found the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Simon Wiesenthal was the famous Nazi hunter, but before he was a Nazi hunter, he was a victim of the Nazis. He and his wife lost 89 members of their family during the World War II Holocaust. Unlike everyone else who survived, and he barely survives, I don't know what 90 pounds is kilo-wise, but he was not strong enough to stand on his feet when the American army came into the camp. Another week, he'd been dead. He never left the Holocaust. Initially, he said it was going to take 3 or 4 years, but he devoted his life to hunting down the murderers of our people, of which unfortunately went into the hundreds of thousands, in a world in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s that had very little interest during the Cold War to deal with, and yet he succeeded in bringing 1,100 Nazi war criminals before the bar of justice. We approached him to give our good name, and I had the honor to know Mr. Wiesenthal, who died at the age of 96, for nearly 30 years. And, maybe one or two stories about him might be of interest. And one is the fact that he understood that he was dealing with a symbolic measure of justice. That true justice for what happened in the genocide is really unattainable. But the fact that the Nazis almost succeeded in obliterating the concept. So 2 stories come to mind. One is, people watch your program may know the name Adolf Eichmann. He was the architect of the final solution. He was in charge of murdering every single Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. And unfortunately, he did a very good job. He disappeared after the war and tried to convince through his wife that he had died so that no one would look for him. Mr. Wiesenthal had a young man, a survivor, who lost everyone. It's in a documentary we did on his life. When you see this young man, even in middle age, it's the perfect Aryan. Tall, blonde, blue eyes. He insinuated himself into the Eichmann family. And one day he came back to Mr. Wiesenthal and said, today Mrs. Eichmann let me take one of her little boys out on the lake. And I'm going back tomorrow and doing the same thing. I'm going to drown him. Just like that. And Mr. Wiesenthal said, you will do no such thing. That's an innocent child. That's not the way the Jewish people operate. We're here for justice. We want to get a convicted criminal. And you know that you're not going to touch that kid. Now, you might say, what kind of lunatic was saying such a thing? That young man had lost everyone in his life because he had the sin of being born Jewish. And he wanted his revenge. So it's one thing in 2014 to reflect back on those days and say, yes, we need to have justice and not vengeance. It's quite another when the people having the conversation had almost everyone they loved ripped from them, murdered, their entire communities destroyed. And yet, from the beginning, Mr. Wiesenthal understood what his job was.
Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of the Nazi death camps, dedicated his life to documenting the crimes of the Holocaust and to hunting down the perpetrators still at large. When asked about his work, Simon Wiesenthal explained, "When history looks back, I want people to know the Nazis weren't able to kill millions of people and get away with it. His work stands as a reminder and a warning for future generations.
Mr. Wiesenthal was not exactly a religious Jew. He had his relationship with God, but it was dicey. Like many survivors, a lot of anger. So he told me that he had a prayer book on his nightstand. He found it to be quite remarkable. And so I asked him to tell me the story. He said he was working for the United States military after World War II. Still recovering. He was in a displaced persons camp, but already sort of contributing to these issues. And one day, he was called in and said, we've just learned that there is a castle not far from here, about 2-3 hours, which supposedly is filled top to bottom with Judaica, taken from Jews before they were murdered. I'm giving you a truck. I'm going to take one of the military chaplains from the States, Jewish chaplain, and one other person. You're to go out, check it out. And they, sure enough, went through the snow, and they came on this magnificent medieval castle. And when they threw open the doors, I couldn't believe it, because it was the remnants of thousands of Jewish families, Shabbat candles, and copies of the Talmud, and you name it. It was there. It was just complete, stunned silence. And after a few minutes, Mr. Wiesenthal said, look, we have to start somewhere. Let's at least, and it'll take way more than one time, let's at least start to put together a list of what's here. So I'll go downstairs, and I sent a soldier upstairs, and the chaplain, if you will, you'll go also to the first floor. And they went their ways, and not 3 minutes later, he heard a yell, a scream, and then a thud. And when he rushed upstairs, it was the chaplain who had fainted, and he was clutching this sitter. And when he came to, he really couldn't speak. He just handed the sitter to Mr. Wiesenthal, and he said, read the inscription. It was hurriedly written in Yiddish, in pencil, and it was written by a woman who said, I don't know how much longer I have to live. The murderers are next door. The murderers are among us. Never forget us. And signed by the chaplain's sister. And a few years later, after he passed, the family sent Simon Wiesenthal the sitter. So Mr. Wiesenthal is a very complicated man, but also, like all people who change history, he just had, he understood that his mission was to represent, to be the ambassador of 6 million innocent souls, and he never left the front. And it came at a great cost. You know, his wife survived. She was hidden by righteous Gentiles. They didn't know that the other had survived for 3 months after the war because such chaos across the continent. They had one daughter, and after Eichmann was captured, she received a threatening phone call that they were going to kill their only child. She had a heart attack. This is 1961. Mr. Wiesenthal rushes to the hospital. His wife, Sila, says, enough. They got Eichmann. You said that you would only do this for 3 or 4 years. Let's get out of here and have a life. And that's a woman who just had a heart attack, and Simon Wiesenthal said to his wife, I cannot go. I'll come twice a year to see you and the daughter because I can't. And she once said that, you know, she felt that Simon Wiesenthal had 2 wives, her and 6 million ghosts. So when you get to know people a little bit up front and you see the enormous human costs and the, you know, the silent heroism, he had his work. She didn't want to be in Austria. So, you know, it gives a real insight, and it puts, you know, a face on a cause. And that was one of the most, you know, wonderful and special opportunities for me in my life to get close to a man like that. And frankly, for me, my Judaism informs my activism. Absolutely is a perfect fit, including not just the issues, of course, taking care of your own families first, but also more generally. Tikkun Olam, civil society, actually is a Jewish invention going back a few thousand years ago. Some people tend to skip right to Tikkun Olam and leave out the rest of the heritage. But they would be doing a better job at building a civil society if they paid a little bit more attention to the Ten Commandments.
One of the most popular South African seaside resorts frequented by Jewish families was Muizenberg. As one of the oldest holiday destinations, it was also, and remains today, a surfer's paradise. In our second episode of our series Stories from Muizenberg, Hetty Davis recounts the tales of the unity and connections people had developed for one another in a time when the days were all about catching that next wave.
People who live in Muizenberg believe that it has mystical qualities. There it is, between the mountain and the sea and the vlei, this beautiful little triangle that just has this exquisite air. To some people, that's the only reason Muizenberg is allowed to exist. And the sea, this year, everybody's so happy the water is warmer than it's been in years. And everybody's so delighted. And everybody's swimming in Muizenberg again this year. I keep on hearing stories about the people who are in Muizenberg. I think also because everybody knew each other and knew everybody else's business. It was very intimate. And while I've been criticized for calling my book The Shtetl by the Sea, and by someone who said a shtetl belongs as terminology to Eastern Europe, a South African small village is a dorp. But you certainly can't call Muizenberg a dorp. Muizenberg in itself was a little shtetl. And I think that intimacy is what, and children growing up and playing in the streets, hopscotch lines across the middle of the road, cricket pitches across the middle of the road. There was such a sense of freedom, and there were such a lot of children growing up in Muizenberg. Across the way, we see a few small semi-detached houses. That is the start of the shtetl. All these tiny little cottages were all the original planners thought were necessary for a fishing village. They regarded Muizenberg as having no future other than as a fishing village. So when we come into the shtetl, you will see all the houses are semi-detached, and they are small, with small rooms and very small plots of land, and were all unicolor. They had the same little balcony, the same little front wall, and one would sleep on the porch in summer. Why not? It was perfectly safe. I'm walking down Fraser Road into the heart of the shtetl. These narrow roads were what the people who lived in them called the Kugelgassen or the Zimmersgassen. Little roads named after the most delicious foods that they would cook on a Friday night. And you'd walk here, and the smell of the food on a Friday afternoon would exude from every single one of these homes. Some were quite grand, as we have on the one side, but again you have the small cottages with their beautiful porches where they would sleep if they needed a spare room in summer. The Hirsches came to Muizenberg by chance, but by 1900, Cecil John Rhodes, who absolutely loved Muizenberg and used to ride out there on a Sunday and often invited guests to lunch at the Hirsches, he supported them very well. Rhodes had bought a house, a little cottage, and the big piece of ground next door to it. Now, the house that we know as Rhodes's cottage is where he died. The day he died, the message went out right round the world. In Muizenberg today, the great statesman Cecil John Rhodes had passed away. So people in India and in Australia heard the name of Muizenberg, and suddenly it rang round the world, and it actually did a great deal to boost the popularity of Muizenberg. The other thing that they called Muizenberg, these people who came from all over the Eastern Europe, was Little Jerusalem. They loved Muizenberg. To Muizenberg was like a holy grail. And in the 20s, they poured into Muizenberg. And that was when it started to be dominated. One of the things that people liked to do when they came to Cape Town, the first thing was when they were taken to Muizenberg was to be photographed in front of the concrete pavilion, because it was so grand an edifice, and that was the photograph that they would send home. They'd arrived. One of the most beautiful stories I do tell, and I have the photograph in the book, is of Solomon Shapiro off the boat. He came together with a companion, and you'll find the picture in the book. That photograph was taken at a very unusual angle. He and his friend are sitting on the round plant area, and behind him are these grand houses along Beach Road. At the back of the photograph was something written in what was not Yiddish. We couldn't read it. The children couldn't read it, and that photograph had come to me from Israel. I sat and puzzled over this photograph, the writing. It was partly German, but it wasn't German. And then one day, a gentleman came to visit us, and he said, "Translator, my wife's the translator for the Knesset." He took the photograph back to Israel, or he took the impressions of the photograph, and he told us what it said. What Solomon Shapiro had written at the back of this photograph was, "What you see behind me are beautiful hotels, and the beautiful canals where the water flows, and where people come in their thousands every Sunday to Muizenberg." That was to tempt his wife to come to South Africa. But the first photograph of her is with their little daughter in front of the pavilion, and she's wearing silk shoes and with little button on them. These were not, I should explain, there were two kinds of people in Muizenberg. There were Lithuanians and there were Litvaks. These were Litvaks. They came from Riga. And she's standing there very protectively with her hand in front of her stomach. She was pregnant, and I think she was afraid that the photograph light might some way harm her child. The tragedy was that she actually died in childbirth with that child. The baby survived, and Shapiro remarried. Now, Shapiro was not a barber. The others were all barbers. He was a coiffeur. He was a real hairdresser. And he took a little shop there in Muizenberg on the beachfront. He had a good eye. He knew what he was doing. And every day customers would come and sit in there. And he took a young boy from Muizenberg, Joe Norman, to help him. Well, before anybody realized, Joe Norman had learned to speak Yiddish and also started his lifelong habit of betting on horses, because that's what he heard in the barber shop. And there were a lot of stories of people who came with very little and did very well in Muizenberg. I'm walking down Palmer Road. Here we have one little house next to another. One might have been a dairy, one might have been the butcher. Alongside that would be a fish shop. In fact, there were 2 fish shops, 3 shoemakers at one time. Well, they called themselves shoemakers, but really they were people who repaired shoes. And here they would make their living in the front of their shop, and many of them would live at the back, because that was how it was done. They worked for 4 months of the year during the season, when Muizenberg is habitable to most people. And the season dictated the good fortune and then eventually the bad fortune of Muizenberg. Because how can any place survive on 4 months' business a year? This whole corner corner. It's at the beginning of Palmer Road Corner Church. And it was from here that people would go and do their shopping. As one lady told me, she went with her mother-in-law to the poultry shop a little further along on the left, and she was taught what kind of chicken for roasting, what kind of chicken for soup, and what kind of chicken if you wanted to make schmaltz. When you came into Trappler's, it was a dark shop, and the smells would exude and the smells would draw you in. The polony, the herring, the cheeses. This was the delicatessen. And the Trappler's lived across the road in this cottage here that's now painted pale green. And he was a man who suffered from multiple sclerosis at a time when very little was known about it. And he would be wheeled across the road and sit in the shop all day, the boss of the place, which was quite an achievement because he really was quite handicapped. The people who came for the 4 months had to pay a heavy price to be there. And Muizenberg became too expensive. By 1949, you could take a plane and go to Israel. Some people started to go down to Durban from Johannesburg. Why drive all the way to Cape Town when you can just go down the road to Durban? And beautiful hotels were opening up in Durban that were modern, with bathrooms en suite, unheard of in Muizenberg.